Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band Podcast. I'm Chris Troiano, joined always by Stephen Canestrisi,
Hello.
and we are incredibly excited to bring you episode number 3, where we'll be showing you our interview with Dr. Mark Jenkins. Mark Jenkins is the principal euphonium player in the United States Marine Band and also an adjunct professor of euphonium at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Steve and I just got done talking with Dr. Jenkins, and he is incredible. Such a large wealth of information. You'll hear that we get into the history of the euphonium, history of the Marine Band. There's a little bit of a few philosophical moments kind of sprinkled in there as well.
Definitely.
But before we get engaged in that interview, Stephen, you want to address some of our emails that we received concerning previous episodes?
Yes, we have a new segment of the show that we like to call corrections, and this is where we get some feedback from listeners, and that's always welcome. We always love to hear from you, and to clarify anything that we talked about or add additional information. And we got some good information from John Connors. He's with the 2nd Cavalry Brigade Band and the 6th Ohio Mounted Buglers. We mentioned them in episode 2, and his very nice email contained a correction when we were talking about field musicians, and particularly the number of field musicians that were assigned to a regiment. So we had mentioned in our episode that each regiment was allotted 2 field musicians, and John's correction is that there were actually 2 field musicians allotted per company. So those field musicians could be fifers, drummers, buglers, and so at the regimental level, you would have a massed group of field musicians, so a fife and drum corps, because the company is under the regiment. So a full strength infantry regiment, their field music would sometimes be 20 musicians with 2 musicians per company, and there are 10 companies in a regiment, so yeah, that equals out to about 20 musicians.
Whereas I think we misspoke in the episode and said that instead of it being at the company level, then the higher regiment level, we said that it was regiment and then brigade up on that level. So we were crisscrossing some information there, probably because we were talking about regimental and brigade bands.
Right. So, yeah. So essentially, we were off one level of organization. So. But then John also went on to say that heavy artillery regiments were organized with 12 companies, so they would have 24 musicians if you do the math. So thank you, John, for that correction. That really helped kind of clarify some things for us. And then we've got 2 other corrections definitions of words that are familiar to us, but may not be familiar to people who aren't, heavily into this research field. You'll hear in the upcoming episode with Dr. Jenkins the word billet a few times, and that just refers to a position or a job. A lot of the times when you're talking about military band musicians, their jobs are referred to as billets. Their positions are referred to as billets. And then the other definition we wanted to throw out there for some previous episodes was the definition of muster. It refers to the process of assembling troops, and it can be used as a verb. When you say muster in, that means a formation of troops was formed and assimilated into the army. And then similarly, when you say muster out, that just kind of refers to the decommissioning process of those soldiers. So hopefully that provides some clarification. And like we said, we always love to hear from you. So if there's any question you have for us or any comments, if you'd like to get in touch with us, please feel free to do that. Our email address is eabb.podcast@gmail.com.
All right. Enjoy the interview with Dr. Mark Jenkins. Welcome, Dr. Mark Jenkins, to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get going, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe what you do for a living, your multiple side hustles and whatnot?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I've been in the Marine Band for 18 years. I can't believe it's been that long. 2002 is when I got in, and graduated from the University of North Texas. Actually, I graduated after I got the job. The job came open in March of 2002. I hadn't quite finished my undergraduate degree. So I auditioned in June of 2002 and kind of had a year left of school to finish kind of online, and I graduated in 2003. But I've been in the band for 2002. Since 2002, I was appointed principal in 2012 when Phil Franke retired after a great 30-year career in the band. And since that time, I've been principal and section leader of the Euphoniums. Section leader is more of an administrative position. And then also section commander of the Euphoniums and French horns. Another administrative position that kind of is more larger in terms of larger area of management over the sections. But main job is principal euphonium in the euphonium section and taking charge of all musical affairs for the section at large. My side hustle, as you put it, is as adjunct professor of euphonium at George Mason University, which I've had since probably around 2013. And it's been a wonderful position. Of course, I got to know you two guys. And
sorry about that.
Yeah. It's been great because I've really been able to expand my teaching chops and also meet wonderful students like yourselves and others. And in the midst of all of that, I got my doctoral degree from George Mason University. And as my dissertation, I did the history of the euphonium in the Marine Band, specifically the biographies of the 46 men who have played the instrument in the band, which is why I think you have me on here today, man.
Yeah.
And so that's been a really great opportunity, kind of the career in the band. I've always loved history. And so, of course, I love music. So the two, being able to be put together for me has just really been a fascinating and enjoyable side thing, on top of the career in music that I've been able to explore, of course, with the dissertation.
Yeah, I know you've been able to give presentations on your research right at like the Army conference.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the Army conference, I did basically a thumbnail version of the paper, the history of euphonium players. It's funny because the dissertation requirements, at least when I did mine at George Mason, were 100 pages. I think it's still the same, 100-page minimum.
Yeah.
Around 100 pages. And I did 400 pages, and you can ask my wife, she's like, how long did this have to be? And I'm like, look, I can't stop writing now. What's fascinating about the story, and of course, hopefully your listeners that are listening to a vintage brass podcast will get this. The story got more and more interesting the farther I was able to dive. And we can get into the details obviously later, but
it's like the Tiger King.
Well, the Tiger King is more of a train wreck that you can't stop watching. And this is more of an interesting historical, journey through what I would call, just kind of, well, it's brass history in America, but it's also, the development of this instrument, the euphonium, which, for all intents and purposes, is kind of I guess all acoustic instruments you could call dinosaurs, but the euphonium really is a fascinating instrument because it's the horn. It's like the last standing horn in the ring that was, a part of all of this brass band movement in the 1820s, 30s, and 30s, 40s, and 50s. Mm-hmm. In America, they had all these different versions, and the euphonium kind of is the last man standing in the ring that kind of won, the evolutionary king that won. And that's what we're all playing today. So that's part of the fascinating story. The other part of the fascinating story is just the lives of these men that played the instrument. Yeah. Because some of them were just real characters, and some of them, their training was so fascinating, and how the instrument evolved in terms of its usage in the band was fascinating. So all these things kind of led me to keep writing until the paper was, like I said, 400 pages long. And I was very proud of it because unlike 50 years ago, or even unlike 20 years ago, you couldn't find information like this about these individual people out there. It just wasn't available. Mm-hmm. It was there, but it was buried in archives somewhere. But with the advent of searchable online searchable newspaper databases like the Chronicling America site from the Library of Congress, where you can just, you can put in a term in a search engine and they will give you every newspaper from Washington, D.C. through a different, through a certain date range that has that word in it. So if you search euphonium in the Washington, D.C. newspapers from 1870 to 1890, you're going to get every mention of the word euphonium in those papers. And so you can see how much that term was used, who was playing, what solos they were playing, where they were playing throughout a 20-year period. And I mean, that alone in terms of data mining, for this type of project was an enormous help. And then the other thing was just all the ancestry websites, like the family history websites that have come up that have access to military records, to census records, to, yearbook photos. I mean, everything that has been digitized. I mean, so the amount that's been written that I was able to write versus what was written just in the 90s was, 100 to 1. It was amazing how much more information I could get out of it.
And
Yeah, those newspaper databases are really invaluable. I mean, because that's how information was disseminated back then. I mean, there's really no other record of a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're really helpful doing research for myself. In episode 1, I mentioned the band that I played in back in Pennsylvania that enlisted as a Civil War band, kind of getting to know that band a little more. All of that information is coming from the newspapers.
Yeah, and it was all there before, but there was no way that you were going to sift through 20 years of old newspapers and to try to find the word euphonium or, the name of your band, but all of a sudden you've got it all there and it's at your fingertips and it takes, 20 minutes and you've got pieces of information that it would have taken months to dig up, and no one was willing to do that before.
Yeah, months and a lot of traveling to the places where.
Well, yeah, and it was unreasonable, and it was unrealistic for anyone to do that, and so no one had done that.
Right.
Now, for your research, the first gentleman that you talked about in the Marine band, did you only talk about the first person that was labeled as a euphonium player, or did you go back into labeled baritone players or even ophicleide players? Like how early back did your research start?
Well, I didn't know how far back I could go at the beginning. I was like, well, this is really murky waters here because, again, nothing had been written. I mean, when I was going through college, the earliest person I heard about, was, Harry Whittier, maybe, and they had the double bell euphonium. But honestly, it was really murky waters. So luckily, two things came into play with this research. The first thing, we just talked about, was this huge database of early newspapers that had these terms like baritone, you could search terms like baritone, sax horn, in these things, and you could bring up these concert programs, because what these bands would do, what the Marine band would do, is they would print their program for either the day of the concert, or the day, the concert the following day, or in a week. They would print the printed program in the or the chosen program in the newspaper with the soloists and what they were playing, the instruments they were playing. So I was able to find certain soloists that were playing sax horn in the Marine band and baritone in the Marine band and euphonium in the Marine band, way before any mention of them in any of the scores or any other kind of other source material. The other thing that was really amazing was, of course, the Marine band library, which is the largest music band library in the country, if not the world. They have so many resources, scholarly resources in the form of dissertations, mainly that were written in the 1950s and 1970s by people about the history of the Marine band, but there's two in particular that were written about Francis Scala, who I think you wanted to ask me about him a little bit later. He was the band director, the leader of the band during the Civil War years, the Lincoln administration, and there's two papers that were written about him and about the library that he left to. Well, he left the library of all of his arrangements that he made for the Marine band during his tenure. He was director of the Marine band from 1855 to 1871. And back then, 99% of all the music that the Marine band played were original compositions or original arrangements. Mm-hmm. You couldn't just go down to, you could go down to a music store and buy stuff, but I'm sure he didn't have the budget for that, in the Marine band. So they just had to write their own things. but the good thing was he was a gifted arranger and a gifted composer. And so when he died, he left the library to his son, who donated to the Library of Congress in the 1950s, actually with an endowment, a monetary endowment to keep studying and research on his father and his father's era. So it's still there. And so these two gentlemen, Ingalls and I'm blanking on the other guy's name. I have it right down here. Hold on, let me check my notes here. It's Ingalls and Leclerc, Paul Joseph Leclerc and David Ingalls, both wrote dissertations for Catholic University for their doctorate degrees, and they wrote it about the Scala library. And the most important thing they did is they included all of the parts lists for all the pieces that he wrote. And he started writing, he got in the band in the 1840s. I think 1842 is when he got in. And so he started writing pretty early on, even though he wasn't leader of the band at that time. And so we have all the parts lists, and in those parts lists, you see, among other things, alphaclide and baritone. He never used the word sax horn in any of his arrangements. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but those two discoveries were the first thing that really showed me that, hey, I can go really far back on this.
So did your research go to baritone?
It went actually to serpent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So what's really cool is there's an 1831 requisition order to the Commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, who I think was Archibald Henderson at the time. The Commandant of the Marine Corps is the head of the Marine Corps underneath the Secretary of the Navy. And this was a requisition order for the Marine Band it was an instrument list that they were ordering from some sort of instrument purveyor in Baltimore, Maryland. And on that instrument list, it handwritten says one serpent. So we know that they ordered a serpent, and we can assume that someone in the band played that instrument for a time. Just backing up a little bit, what's fascinating about the Marine Band versus brass bands, which you guys focus on mainly, is that the Marine Band is unique because I think if certain things hadn't happened in the early 19th century, it would have been a regular brass band, just like all the other brass bands that that popped up in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. It would have been a conventional brass band, I think. But what happened is the first job the Marine, of course, for your listeners who don't know the story, the full history of the Marine Band was started by an act of Congress in 1798. And the original act of Congress, this is also when the Marine Corps was reinstated after the Revolutionary War. It became the United States Marine Corps versus the Continental Marine Corps. And in that act, it called for 32 fifers and drummers. That was it. And it said 32 fifers and drummers to constitute a Marine Band, or the Marine Band. So that's how we get our name, and that was our start by an act of Congress. That was it. There was no other directions or pay instructions. In fact, the band at the beginning was paid out of the pockets of the officers. So whenever the officers would want a concert or a ceremony, they'd have to pay the members of the band out of pocket. That we had no set wage from the government.
That actually became pretty common for regimental brass bands during the mid and late Civil War. Also,
oh, really?
Yeah, they would have the upper leadership, or sometimes donors from the town where the regiment was formed. They would be the ones to help sustain the band financially.
Yeah, so it seemed like it was a tradition that held on. And that tradition actually held on all the way until the Civil War, which we can get to in a second, but the Lincoln administration. But so at the beginning, they were just fifers and drummers, and Congress didn't give them any kind of funding for other instruments. Though that's pretty much what happened. As far as I can tell, around the turn of the century, they started transitioning to more of a harmony music instrumentation. So we had clarinets, flutes, oboes, horn, including, and then also percussion. But according to the U.S. government, they were still billeted as fifers and drummers. There was no delineation at that point. And that lasted for quite some time. But what's interesting is that during the Jefferson administration, the first White House job we did was on New Year's Day, 1801, for John Adams. And that's right after he lost the election to Thomas Jefferson. But Abigail and him were throwing a New Year's Day party at the White House, which hadn't even been finished. It was still under construction at that point. And they invited the Marine Band to come. We don't know what instrumentation they had at that point. But that was their first gig at the White House. And then when he left office in March and Thomas Jefferson came in as the new president, Thomas Jefferson was an avid music lover. He played the violin. He loved music. And there's part of this that is colloquial, and there's part of this that's actually documented. So the part of it that I don't think is documented is that basically Jefferson was not happy with the Marine Band in terms of maybe quality or instrumentation. I don't know. But he asked the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, whose name was William Ward Burroughs, and to actually dispatch an officer, and we know the name of the officer's name was Captain John Hall, to Italy. And at the time, Italian musicians, I guess, were known to be very, well-trained and prestigious. And to basically go on a mission, a Marine Corps, a government-funded mission to enlist musicians, Italian-trained musicians, to augment the ranks of the Marine Band. And so he did it. He left on the trip, but the problem was that while he was gone, of course, the voyages took so long back then, the commandant of the Marine Corps changed, and the new commandant, Frank Worden, had no idea that this was going on. He got dispatches back from John Hall saying, hey, I can't remember the exact number of Italian musicians, but they recruited a good number of them along with their families on the ship, promising them jobs in America. And so they came, and he got this dispatch saying, hey, we got all these Italians coming. And he's like, whoa, cease and desist. I don't know what you're talking about here. I don't want Italian musicians at the Marine Barracks. And of course, Marine Barracks in DC was just being built at that point.
Is that where you guys are now? That one?
Well, yeah, we're in the annex next to it, but the band was there for 200 years. So. Mm-hmm. It's the Marine Barracks at 8th and I Street. That was the first permanent installation for Marines in the U.S.
Gotcha.
So it was just being built. And so by the time they got there, Frank Worden was like, look, I don't want these guys. They can't speak any English. This is a serious problem. They're not regular Marines. We can't use them. So part of them, as the story goes, part of them just took one look at DC, which was a swamp at the time, and didn't even want to get off the boat. They said, no, we're out of here. So they went back to Italy.
Yikes.
But the other part stayed, and I think part of them worked on the building of the barracks. And what was fascinating is, I guess, I don't know why, maybe it was, a little xenophobia, or maybe it was the language barrier, or maybe it was just Frank Worden saying these guys aren't Marines. But for a time, there were two Marine bands. And I've seen early articles in early newspapers in DC that talk about the two Marine bands. There's the Italian Marine Band and just the Marine Band. So over time, they split into two. But then eventually they came back. But what's interesting about that is it brought over fantastically trained musicians that actually became the backbone. These Italians became the backbone of band leadership for the next 50 years, which is really interesting, because what that did is it brought Europeans into the mix that had a very specific vision of what a band should be. And it was not a brass band. Right. It was a band with a full complement of woodwinds and brasses.
Why did Europeans have that greater sense of the ensemble than over here? Why did that develop differently when the instruments were being developed, at the same time?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can give you a complete answer. I do know. I'm assuming that because they had more of a history of classical music. They had the harmony music section of the orchestra. They had the two oboes, the two flutes, the two bassoons, the two horns that had been, established in Europe, at least in Germany, as the symphonists the symphony orchestra was slowly evolving, and that the symphony in terms of instrumentation had evolved by that point.
Yeah, and the way I understand it is that harmony music ensemble was sometimes referred to as a band, right, in Europe. So especially the Italian and the German immigrants who came over to the United States, that's where, you kind of had both the American brass bands of just brass and these Italian and German immigrants who were coming over with their idea. And that's why you see kind of a mixing of the two ensembles in the United States. And the brass band never really kind of took over a complete hold on the band term and what you think of when you think of a band. And you get kind of the mix of brass and woodwinds that we have now. At least that's the way I make sense of it in my head.
It must have been something like that, because throughout the 19th century, even as the brass band movement gained enormous popularity, even in Washington, D.C., the regimental brass band movement, military brass band. The Marine band stuck to their guns. They never abandoned their brass band or their woodwind section. And a lot of their players, including Scala himself, was a clarinet player. And so, they always had a complement of woodwinds. And two, what the European band leaders brought over that the American band leaders didn't do was an absolute love for the masters. So especially opera.
Yeah.
So you'll see in the 1840s and 50s and 60s throughout Scala's tenure, especially, the band is always doing something by, Donizetti or by Verdi or by Bellini, that's always, or Liszt, it's always the European masters. And what's interesting about that is that tradition continued all the way until today, where the Marine band is known to be a lot more, conservative is not the right word, but it's a lot more rooted in classical transcription and classical, the large classical works versus more popular fare. Yeah. And that was a big differentiation between the Marine band and other brass bands of, say, the Civil War period later, was that the Marine band just didn't do as much popular stuff as the brass bands. The brass band did all pop stuff, the Yankee Doodle, that kind of stuff, folk songs, popular ballads of the day. But the Marine band would they did that stuff, but they always, for the White House, and maybe that was the differentiation, because we played at the White House so much, and they didn't want to hear a lot of that stuff because they had, heads of state coming over from Europe.
Yeah.
So we always did the formal stuff, the Bellini, and actually, we're going to talk about this a little bit later as we get farther in the history. That actually helped the evolution of the euphonium, because when Francis Scala was writing his transcriptions of these opera duets, because he'd always transcribe an aria, He'd do an aria duet between a soprano and a tenor. Well, he didn't have any singers, so he would do a soprano cornet for the soprano part, and then he would use a baritone to play the transcribed tenor part. So all of a sudden, you've got a baritone in front of the band. But to get back to your earlier question, so the serpent was obviously the first documented instrument that I found. But going through newspapers, I also found that and through the Scala parts list, I found they used an ophicleide. So they definitely used an ophicleide, and I found at least one arrangement or two arrangements, one by Scala and one by his predecessor, Trahi, who was director of the band just before Scala, that used ophicleide parts. And I actually I couldn't believe I found this, but I found an old newspaper article giving me the name of an ophicleide player in the band. Nice. And his name was Antonio Pons, which is interesting because, again, another Italian who actually became leader of the band sometime after. This is before Francis Scala became leader of the band, but he started out as an ophicleide player in the 1840s. They were still using ophicleide until at least 1848. I know that because of the dates on the arrangement parts from the Scala library.
There's probably some overlap by that point, right?
I'm sure there was, and again, that's the murky area. But he was at least playing ophicleide until 1848 before he moved on to drum major of the band and then leader of the band. Those two positions were different. Drum major and leader of the band were different as they are today.
What's the difference between those?
Well, the leader of the band used to be a fife major. Like I said before, for a long time it was just fife major and fifes and drums. So there was a fife major and a drum major, and the drum major was always the leader of the band default between the two, even though their uniforms were identical, their rank was identical. But during the Lincoln administration, as I said before, everything got reorganized, and the term fife major was dropped because they knew the band didn't play just fifes and drums anymore. So the fife major became the designated, and this is the title, leader of the band, and that title was the official military title of the band leader. His rank pay was that of a sergeant, but he didn't have a separate rank. His rank name was leader of the band for years, before it was finally changed to an officer rank. But what's interesting is that we have all of the enlistment records for the Marine Corps, for the band, up back to 1798. So I used to go in and look at all the band members' names, and what's tantalizing is that that all the players that played baritone or euphonium, they're all there right in front of your face. There's no parts listed or instruments listed that, on what they played. So you'll never know. And it's just, they used to drive me insane because they're right. You can see their names. It's right there. But so the first person that I found who actually played a tenor sax horn, which was later called a baritone, and we can get into terminology, how they use that a little bit later, but was a guy named Louis Weber. And what's interesting about Louis Weber and then another guy who played baritone, John Prosperi, about the same time, Louis Weber got in 1850. Both of those guys and many others were graduates of what became known as the Marine Band Apprentice Program, which was really fascinating because we don't know exactly when it started, sometime in the early 1800s, but what it was a pipeline for young boys in DC to basically be joined to the Marine Band, almost like indentured servants. It was pretty close to that. Their fathers, what'd you say?
Isn't that what your guys' number one star did also? Didn't Sousa come in as a drummer boy through that program?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he did. Yeah. And the program lasted until the early 1900s when I'm sure labor laws were passed and you can't have boys working in the military. But, so they would bring boys in as young as maybe 12, and their fathers would sign them up and they would basically have a 15-year apprenticeship. 10 to 15 years, something like that. And they were housed at the barracks, though some boys lived so close they could just live at home. They were given pay, and deductions from their pay were made for their schooling and for their clothes, room and board. But they were trained by the drum major of the Marine Band to be either drummers and or fifers. If they were really good, they were trained on actual instruments, regular acoustic instruments of the band, and they were allowed to audition for the band at the end of their apprenticeship. If they weren't good enough to make the Marine Band, then they were just used as ceremonial fifers and drummers out in the fleet. And bugle also was added to that. So they would be deployed on ships out in the fleet to play ceremonies on ships, wherever Marines were present, or wherever there was a camp of Marines. And so Louis Weber was one, John Prosperi was one, like you said, John Philip Sousa was one. There's another guy that came in later, William Grosskirth. There was a lot of these guys whose fathers were in the Marine Band. John Prosperi's father, John Francis Prosperi, was in the Marine Band. It was like a family business for these guys. They did it, their sons did it, their sons' sons did it. And it was the same with the Sousas. Antonio Sousa was John Philip Sousa's father. He was in the Marine Band. John Philip Sousa's brother was in the Marine Band. That's what you did. They all lived in Southeast Washington, D.C. And that it was like a family of plumbers, but they were musicians. That's exactly what happened. They were all very down to earth. That was the trade, and you learned your trade. And for poor families at the time, it must have been a godsend, because it's like, okay, you're going to take my kid, you're going to feed him, you're going to clothe him, you're going to school him, and we get paid. Oh, that's amazing. Here, take them. I can imagine it was a great deal for them. So Louis Weber was the first, and he was a really interesting character because he was a very talented musician. He was primarily a violinist and a double bassist. And to get to kind of the subject of your show, he also did what many current and former Marine Band guys did in the 19th century. After they left, and sometimes when they were still in the band, they formed their own brass bands on the side. And so Louis Weber, Prosperi did this. John Prosperi's father did this. A guy named William Withers did this, who was also a member of the band at the time. They would leave the Marine Band after a time, after their apprenticeship, after they played in the band for a while, and they would form their own cornet bands that would hire out throughout the city. Which is ironic. The irony is that they would use mainly guys from the Marine Band. So it really was the Marine Band, but under a different name. And they would do cruises. You'd hire a band to be on a ship to go down the Potomac River to Mount Vernon or wherever. They would do picnics, a lot of picnics. They would do these things where public speakers or politicians would hire them to go. Basically, they would set up under their window of their house, and they would play music to draw a crowd, and then the politician would come out and give a speech in order to get reelected, or a speech on a certain topic. That was the days before any kind of television or radio. That was mass media. So the bands were very important in that effort, which I thought was really fascinating. But Louis Weber was the first, and the first documented baritone range instrument performance that I ever found. So he was playing a tenor sax horn. This is as named in the press. In 1855, there was a duet with a cornet. They were playing an arrangement by Scala of I think a Bellini aria, and that was the first. That's the earliest known newspaper article of a baritone range instrument being featured as a soloist.
Can you go through briefly the evolution? I know you mentioned the serpent earlier, and it's dawning on me that some people might not be super familiar with what even a serpent is.
Well, a serpent is basically it does have, I think later iterations had keys, but mainly they were just bored holes in a wooden serpent-shaped instrument. It's like an S shape. Usually was bound by leather with holes in it, and it was like a flute in that way, but you had a mouthpiece that you made vibrations with, and then you controlled the pitch, the length of the instrument with the holes.
And that's regarded as being like the earliest predecessor to these low instruments, right?
And then the keyed brasses came in the 1820s, so you had the Auffelkleid and the keyed bugle. And so that's basically what the Marine Band used. And a lot of, other brass bands in the U.S. military started using those at that time. But what happened that I found, one thing that happened in the 1840s that was really seminal to the evolution of the euphonium in the Marine Band, and I think in the country, because by the 1830s, you had companies like Dodworth and stuff that were making valved brasses, rotary valved brasses, which were either upright or over the shoulder. But what happened in 1849 is that the Distin family came to America. So John Distin was a British brass player. He'd played in the band of King George IV in England. And he had a very talented family. He had basically 3 sons that were very talented brass players. He had a daughter that sung. And they were touring throughout Europe on their British-made instruments, or maybe, I can't remember what the maker of their instruments were, but they met Adolph Sax at the time in Paris. And Sax was doing a demonstration of his instruments, and John Distin basically said, I would love you to make us custom-made bell front brass instruments. We'll take them around the world. So Sax jumped at the chance because Distins were famous at that point. And so he made them 4 bell front brass instruments in different voices. One of John's sons, George Distin, played a B-flat baritone sax horn. And that's what they toured with. And they came to the United States in 1849. They did a huge tour of the States. And on March 3rd, 1849, they came to Washington, D.C. They played at a saloon, or is it a salon? The spelling in these newspaper articles is kind of variable. So I never could tell if it was a saloon or a salon. Maybe let's just say it was a salon. It was an upper class thing.
Right.
And they played a concert, and they played multiple times for multiple days in D.C. And I can't, there's no direct evidence that it influenced the instrumentation of the Marine Band, but it definitely influenced the trajectory of brass instruments in America. After that tour, all of a sudden the term sax horn was introduced to America. And what's interesting is after that tour, a lot of local regimental brass bands, there was one down in Staunton, Virginia, that made direct orders to Sax himself for French-made sax horns. And the name sax horn became completely ubiquitous for any kind of brass instrument. It was all sax horns.
It's like
any kind of conical instrument,
like a Q-tip or a Vaseline or something.
Yeah, or Kleenex.
Band-Aid.
Yeah. It became that's what the instrument became known as. And so the evolution from serpent to Auffelkleid now kind of revolved around 3 different instruments, but they were very similar. So you had the tenor sax horn, you had the baritone sax horn, and you had the B-flat bass sax horn. And of course, most of the major catalogs of the 1850s have these 3 different models in them. And they all had different parts. And I got this information from a great old article that Mark Elrod had about, it was an old manual, how to set up your own brass band. This was from the 1850s. And it talked about the different uses of the 3 instruments. So the tenor horn, or the tenor sax horn, was used to basically double the cornet at the octave in terms of scoring. So this is how to write for these instruments. So you'd use it to fill out the mid-range right of the cornet, so the cornet can't get that low, so you fill out the mid-range by doubling at the octave, when you're playing a melody with the tenor sax horn. It had the smallest of all those bores of the three instruments.
Yeah, I was going to say this is going from most cylindrical to most conical, right?
Yeah, the bore gets they're all the same length.
Yeah,
but they all have different. But the bore size gets wider and wider, so the sound gets deeper and deeper. So that's the tenor sax horn. The baritone is the soloist. It's the soloist instrument of the band. So all the solos that I mentioned before, they're given to the baritone. And then the bass sax horn was known as the top voice of the tuba family. So it was the B flat bass, then the E flat bass, then the double B flat bass. Sometimes they have a double E flat bass, but usually it was just those three. And so those were the three roles of that instrument. And I noticed that the evolution of what we now know as the modern euphonium was the eventual coalescing of those three instruments into one single horn.
And when did that term start getting used, euphonium?
That didn't get started used in America. That wasn't used until the 1880s, really. Did you want to go on to that, or did you want to talk more about the Civil War and about Scala? I know that was one of your questions that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, we can get to Scala a little bit later. I think we can finish out this evolution of this instrument. Yeah.
Sure. So really, throughout the 1860s, in the Marine Band, as far as the Marine Band goes, the first baritone solo that I was able to find was from the 1850s somewhere. It was a Scala arrangement of a Donizetti aria. It was Farino. I can't remember the opera's name, but it was a baritone solo within the band. And I actually played that on that Army Band recital that I did. And it's a really great little solo, and it's very clearly marked in the parts that it was a baritone solo. So that's the first one. So the 1850s marked the very first time in the Marine Band, anyway, that the baritone was used as a soloist and called a baritone. So I'm assuming it was a baritone, even though I have no proof of exactly what type of instrument they used. And I think that's one thing that's interesting to mark. We always wonder how the word baritone got used as a default word for euphonium. We always both those terms in America are interchangeable, where that's not the case in other countries. I think part of it was because the baritone was the solo instrument of the band, and I think that just stuck with American audiences long before the word euphonium came in. Baritone was. And so when you see an instrument, a conical low brass instrument in front of the band in the 19th century, they'd say that's a baritone because that's the solo instrument. So throughout the Civil War, those were the three basic, tenor, baritone, and bass were the three basic voices. After the Civil War, and when Lewis Gilmore started becoming, not Gilmore.
Patrick Gilmore?
Patrick Gilmore, thank you. Yeah. Patrick Gilmore started becoming very famous with his concert band. He even ditched the brass band in favor of concert band. Of course, the Marine Band still had a concert band with woodwinds and things. So he stopped the whole tenor and baritones. The name saxhorn started going out of favor. And so then you started having just a baritone. You had a tenor horn. You still had tenor horn, baritone, and B flat bass at that point in all the catalogs that I found in the 1870s. Then what was happening in England, though, at the same time, is also very relevant. So the Distin family, after they did the touring, they went back to England and started their own company. They're an instrument company importing sax horns. And we don't know exactly what happened, but they had a falling out with Sax because they started marketing his horns under their label, a Distin horn. So Sax got mad at them and stopped using them. The other thing that they did, though, the Distin company, is they bought the patent from Ferdinand Sommer for his original euphonion, what he was calling the euphonion back in the 1840s, the one that he brought over to play for the Grand Exposition for Queen Victoria. There's actually a picture of that somewhere. You can look it up online, of Ferdinand Sommer playing his euphonion for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. So they bought the patent for that from Ferdinand Sommer because he had been touring around England soloing with that instrument. And they've also bought the name. So they started manufacturing instruments called euphonions from the 1850s, at least, in England. And of course, that's about when the brass band movement started going full blast in England. And so the euphonium started becoming very, popular in Great Britain. And how euphonium became euphonium, I'm not quite sure. I think they used both terms in England, but up in as late as the 1890s, I've seen in boozy arrangements, euphonium arrangements, they were still using the term euphonion. So it didn't die early on. It was kept for quite a long time. But one thing that happened is that these British bands throughout the 1860s and 70s started coming to America and touring. So the term euphonion started being heard. And when Distin sold out to Boozy in the 1860s, 1868, I think is when he sold his company. It was actually Distin's son who sold. Boozy started a shop in New York City. So we know that euphoniums or euphonions probably were being sold in New York. So an instrument called that had arrived on the shores of America by, as early as the 1870s, maybe. We don't know the exact dates. But what really got it started was the Simon Mantilla's teacher. And for some reason, I'm blanking on his name. Can you guys remember? It was Raffaello. I couldn't remember that all of a sudden. Yeah, it's Raffaello.
Raffaello.
Right, yeah, that guy, Raffaello. Yeah. Joseph Raffaello. So what happened was that Patrick Gilmore was starting his band, and he was always looking for great soloists. And the story goes that he was in Paris, and he found this guy, Joseph Raffaello, playing with the King's Band of Italy. This is in the 1870s. We don't know what kind of horn he was playing, but when he came over to the States, the very first article that I was able to find, the earliest one I was able to find from New York, was Raffaello playing on what was called a double baritone trombone, or a double trombone baritone, something like that. I'm guessing or surmising at that Patrick Gilmore probably saw him playing that in Europe, and that's probably why he hired him. He probably said to himself, not only is this guy good, but he's playing on an instrument that I've never seen before. And of course, what duplex instruments, instruments that have more than one bell, have been manufactured. They were manufactured in Europe for many years before that. Sax had manufactured them. A guy named Poletti, an Italian manufacturer, had also done those. And maybe he was playing one of Poletti's instruments. We don't know. But I'm assuming that Gilmore, basically, as any good American showman at the time would have said, that's box office. So he saw a guy playing he's playing a weird instrument, and he was playing it well. So he's like, I need to get this guy over here. So he hired him away from the King's Band of Italy, brought him over, and Joseph Raffaello, and this is in 1882, I think, Joseph Raffaello became the first known person to play a double-belled baritone instrument in America. So that was 1882. So fast forward to 1889, and the Gilmore Band is the most famous band in America, apart from the Marine Band. But the Marine Band can't tour like the Gilmore Band could tour. And the Marine Band was a military, organization, while the Gilmore Band was, even though it had the name like 22nd Regiment, New York Regiment, or whatever it was, that was just for show. They weren't really a military ensemble, so they were getting paid a ton of money. In fact, I found a old reference to what Raffaello was making. He was making like $70 a week or something like that. And for that time, it was huge amount of money. And I looked up the salary for the Marine Band. It was like $1 a week. I mean, it was so pathetic. I think street sweepers at the time in DC were making about as much as we were. And so that shows you, the disparity there. And the reason the Marine Band was able to even get top talent was the promise that they could do outside jobs, which is what made them the most money. But Raffaello had that horn, and it really helped him, and it helped the baritone become popular as a solo instrument in the 1880s. What's also interesting is that if you look at the newspaper articles from 1880 to 1900, the word euphonium starts getting used more and more. And mainly that's due to the entrance of C.G. Kahn into the mix. So Kahn started manufacturing instruments, I think, in the 1880s. I'm sure, I'm not exact on those dates. I might have them in the paper. I didn't write them down in my notes. But he he saw Gilmore's band, he saw Raffaello's horn, and he wanted to have a patented American version of the instrument. And so I think it was in 1887 or 8, that's when he came out with the double bell euphonium. And he used the word, he called it a euphonium. The euphonium was the top of the line. The other ones were baritones, he had baritones, he had tenor horns, but the euphoniums were the top of the line. If you wanted a top two bell instrument, it was the con euphonium, double bell euphonium. And so that was, I think, 1887, 1888 time frame. And so from that moment on, and of course, William Whittier, also of Gilmore's band, and Raffaello, they started calling everything euphonium. All the press started calling it a euphonium. And in the Marine band, the guy at the time was let's see, Henry Schultz was his name. He was the euphonium soloist, baritone soloist before 1889. Afterwards, in all the newspapers, he's billed as euphonium soloist. So the term was adopted fairly quickly. And I have to assume that it's partly due because of Gilmore's band and how, they were the Michael Jackson, of their day in terms of popularity. And one of their lead soloists was playing a double bell euphonium. And then after 1889, they were playing con double bell euphoniums. And so, that kind of put everything into the public consciousness, and the popularity of town bands was also on the rise as well. So everyone was looking to get a double bell euphonium. What's interesting too, getting back to the evolution, all that a double bell euphonium is a combination of a B flat bass and a B flat baritone horn. So as I said before, the history of the horn, is kind of the coming together of the tenor, baritone, and bass. Well, with a double bell euphonium, you have a literal, like a physical representation of that coming together. And so the double bell euphonium kind of was born, and the Marine band adopted it. When Sousa became the director of the Marine band in 1880, he signed, at some point in his tenure, he signed an exclusive contract with Conn Music Instruments. So all the instruments of the band, or at least the ones that he advertised for Conn with their principal players, were Conn instruments. So the guy who replaced Henry Schultz as the principal euphonium in the band was Joseph Giovannini in 1892. And that's right as the Marine band started to tour under Sousa. And so on all the backs of the programs, they had Conn testimonials. And one of those was for the Conn double bell euphonium by Joseph Giovannini. And you can look up online the Marine band. If you just Google Marine band tour, you can see a really great picture of the entire Marine band, black and white picture from their 1892 tour with the two euphonium players in the front row. And there's Joseph Giovannini with his Conn double bell sitting right there in the front row. That's awesome. What's also interesting is that in the Marine band, we still kept the differentiation between a euphonium and a baritone. But by the 1890s, the only differentiation was that a euphonium had two bells and a baritone just had one bell. And you can see it in that picture that I just mentioned. So the other guy was named William Santelmann, who actually became the director in the 1890s after Sousa's successor got fired. That's another story. But he was only playing a single bell baritone, and that differentiation remains today. So on all the music we play with two euphoniums in the band, because Sousa started that tradition in the Marine band using two euphoniums. And one of the folders is always labeled baritone, and one of the folders is always labeled euphonium, even to this day in the Marine band as tradition. So that's where we got the double bell euphonium, and the double bell euphonium stayed as the preeminent solo instrument in all of the Golden Age bands for the next 70 years. It wasn't until World War II, really, that that started to change. And of course, we know what happened. We know the story of Harold Brash bringing over a single-belled boozy, compensating at that point euphonium, a four-valve compensating euphonium. And of course, in the 1870s, the compensating system was developed by David Blakely to figure out how to eliminate the terrible tuning problems of brass instruments. It's hard to add more tubing to a third valve slide. It's going to be 3 feet long past the bottom bow of your instrument to make the notes flatter, especially the 1, 2, and 3 combination. But Blakely, basically added that tubing in different places by extending each of the valve pistons and hiding the tubing in a very unique way and patenting it. So Boozy already had that technology, and it came over big time after World War II when the principal euphonium of the Navy band, Harold Brash, picked one up from one of the Navy bands from England, had come over from with Winston Churchill to visit President Roosevelt at the time during the war. And he said, this is so much better than a double bell euphonium. And that was it. That was the death knell. And then his student, Arthur Lehman, who was principal euphonium of the Marine band, who would become, in 1956, ordered 5 or 4 brand new Boozy, at that point, Boozy and Hawks instruments. And that was, I think it was that same year that Kahn, or around that time, that Kahn finally ceased all production of the double bell. King was the last holdout. I think they stopped production of their double bells like in the 60s, early 60s. But that's when the compensating, from the 1950s on, the compensating British model of euphonium basically ruled. There were other different variations, like the bent bell American euphoniums were still in up until the 70s. But then in 1978 or 79, that's when the Blakely 100-year patent ran out, or it was a 99-year patent on the compensating system ran out. Mm-hmm. And so all the makers, so that's when you see Wilson come in, that's when you see Yamaha come in, Hirschbrunner comes in, and then all of a sudden, all these guys from that generation in 1970s and early 80s, Luke Spiros, Brian Bowman, Glenn Call, all these guys start experimenting with these new horns. And at that point, any kind of American-made horn is pretty much out. And Wilson, from that little arms race there in the late 70s, Wilson emerged kind of the victor throughout the 1980s and 90s, even to today. Most of American military band players play on a Wilson.
Yeah, all three of us do.
Yeah, and that's mostly due to Brian Bowman, who was our teacher, who's my teacher and Chris's teacher, and who was principal of the Navy band and principal of the Air Force band, who developed the Wilson and just toured around the country, kind of like the Distins did, and really popularized the instrument. So, but in terms of getting from the Serpent till today, there you go. You've just gotten the thumbnail sketch.
Yeah. So, that's going to be a reference for people's dissertations. You just gave everybody the answer for.
There's a lot more to it too. I tried to write some notes before going on here, and I had to stop. I'm like, there's just too much information. I was like, there's no way I can fit this in. But in a thumbnail, that's basically it. And as much as we, as euphonium players, just wish the double bell euphonium really had not happened, it was so impractical. It was a show. It was a shtick. It really was. It was a shtick.
It's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Kahn tried to bill it as this really cool thing that if you have a small band, the little bell can be can help with the trombone sound. The big bell can help with but it was a shtick. It was a marketing ploy, and the euphonium players at the time knew it. They never used a little bell. Simon Mantilla, who was principal euphonium of the Sousa band, he never used that little bell ever, not that we know of. And so it was useless. And so when the Boozies came in, everyone was like, "Thank heaven, this is looks like a serious instrument." And so as much as we just poo-poo the double bell, though we all go out and buy them, because they look cool. If it hadn't been for the double bell, if it hadn't been for Raffaello and Simon Mantilla and those guys that got out front with that instrument, and the composers that wrote for it, and just the uniqueness of it, I don't know if the euphonium would still be here. I mean, it might be in some iteration, like as a historic instrument, kind of like the sax horn. But in terms of where we're at now, I don't know. I don't know if it would be. I think it gave us a notoriety, and it gave us a toehold. I'll give it that. It didn't. We're not the trumpet. We're not the trombone, in terms of cultural significance. But because of all the press that the double bell euphonium and the likes of Simon Mantilla and all the other guys that are around his time in the golden age of bands gave that instrument, it gave us a toehold in musical culture of the time. And I think that toehold held us over until today. And of course, people like Brian Bowman, of course, all the Europeans, since the world has gotten a lot smaller in the recent years, obviously the euphonium has blossomed to much more than that, but to more than the band culture. But I think it kept us going. I think the euphonium kept us going through the lean years of the mid-20th century, when bands were out, orchestras were in, and especially their Vietnam years, when military bands were really out, that kind of a thing. So
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's important, and I think we owe it a lot, even though we want to disown it sometimes.
It's interesting how like it was the primary instrument and featured instrument for over 50 years, and then when we see one today at a Tuba Christmas event, we always think, man, that guy's weird kind of thing. Like it's so foreign for us to see those now.
But that was it, and that was what whatever the euphonium had meant before. Kahn picked it, named his instrument the double euphonium. Whatever it meant, it didn't matter. From 1889 to the 1940s, the euphonium in America was the double bell.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And so, for better or for worse, and that's how the euphonium, and that's another reason why we should be grateful to the double bell, is it got the word euphonium into the American lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it wasn't a boozy, it was a double bell, and that's what Americans saw as a double bell. And maybe that's another reason why people call baritones, starting from the 1960s, is because it only had one bell. And so the old guys that were used to seeing double bell euphoniums and single bell baritones said, well, that's a baritone, referring to the boozy euphonium. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting.
And then just as one final side note on this euphonium history, I have written down that it's often cited that the first fully composed composition for euphonium was written in 1872 by Amilcare Ponchielli, the Concerto por Flacorno Basso.
Yes.
Do you know, can you briefly explain what the Flacorno Basso is and maybe how that fits into this large timeline that we kind of just went over?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Flacorno Basso, unfortunately, is a more of a generic term. It just means bass horn. It doesn't mean it's not as specific as, say, euphonium or tenor sax horn. It's just a bass horn. And I would assume that it corresponds roughly to a B flat bass that would have been found in brass bands in the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that the B flat bass by the 1870s in America, at any rate, was considered almost obsolete. They're like, look, if you've got tubas and you've got baritones, why do you need a B flat bass? But the B flat bass is what our modern euphoniums are closest to.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. The bore size of our modern euphoniums is more closely to that than a baritone, or certainly not a tenor horn. Mm-hmm. And so it's fascinating to me that they said it was useless, but then 100 years later, that's all we're playing. But in terms of Ponchielli, I don't think anyone knows exactly what they were using at the time. I mean, maybe there's an Italian brass historian that you guys could have on, that would be able to tell you exactly what the brass instrumentation was in Italian bands in the 1870s. I don't know. Mm-hmm. The Italians were extremely influential in the development of the euphonium in America, because in the 1880s, because bands were so popular, all of these Italian musicians knew that they could make a good amount of money touring, and so all these Italian bands started coming over to America, and a lot of the Italian musicians stayed. Like Raffaello, Mantilla, even to Falcone, Leonard and Nicholas Falcone, that came over in the early 1900s, who went on to become the two band directors of Michigan State and University of Michigan. And Leonard Falcone was one of the preeminent euphonium players and teachers in the mid 20th century. They came over, and if you look at a list of the main soloists of all the main bands in the golden age of bands, like Creator's band and Liberati's band, they all were Italians. I mean, all the names were Italian. Mm-hmm. All the top lists of C.G. Kahn's artists were all Italians, and of course Mantilla was the number one. Mm-hmm. So the Italian influence on the euphonium is undeniable. I mean, it's if it hadn't been for them, there would be no double bell euphonium, because Raffaello brought it over.
Yeah.
And if it hadn't been for Mantilla and his like, I don't think and their amazing ability and skill, and the fact that Mantilla recorded, we have recordings of him. I think that, and the shadow that Mantilla has cast over the 20th century, I think that they were responsible for a huge leap in the ability and the skill level of euphonium players. Mm-hmm. A huge leap, because you have to remember, up until the 1960s and 70s, euphonium players were not formally trained. Again, it was like the child apprentices. It was an apprenticeship. If you had some talent and you could find someone that could play, or you could hear them in concert, you could train yourself, but it was mainly self-teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to have people like Mantia in the early 20th century playing insanely hard stuff that he writes for the instrument that sounds like fiddle music, but played, or flute music but played on a euphonium. Yeah. I mean, that rose the whole level of euphonium playing. I mean, I've looked at the music that Marine band euphonium players are playing all the way up in the 1890s and early 20th century, and they are all very much opera repertoire. So it's all these transcribed either opera or oratorio arias, mainly. The first theme and variation solo that I found was from 1899. Joseph Giovannini played it. It was a boozy arrangement. And again, it was theme and variations, but it was on a Verdi tune. And what's interesting in terms of euphonium repertoire, in terms of evolution, is from in the 19th century, most of it, in terms of the Marine band, was all classical music. It was all opera-based classical music, and music from the pop side of things what didn't really come in until the 20th century. The guy that really brought that in was Ole May. So Ole May was the Marine band's first real virtuoso euphonium player. At his height, he was considered second only to Simon Mantia. His nickname was the Man with the Golden Tone. And he came in 1903, but he'd already been playing with Brooks' Chicago Marine Band for many years, and other bands in Cleveland. But he came in 1903, and the band structure at the time, you started out as a third-class musician, and you went to second class, and the highest, most senior guys in the band were first class. If you were really good, and if you were just an amazing player, you could sometimes come in as first class. Of course, we're talking about pay here.
Yeah.
So Santelmann, who was the director of the band at the time, William Santelmann, must have promised Ole May really good pay because he came in as first class. And he was the one that brought in the vernacular type of pieces. So you get polkas all of a sudden, you get theme and variations written, by people like Gardel Simons and things like that are all of a sudden be played. And he doesn't play as much classical repertoire as the earlier guys did.
Yeah.
And that had to do, again, with Simon Mantia. I think Santelmann probably said, we got to have someone who can match Mantia. And he found Ole May, and he said, well, this guy's close enough. and he's willing to go with the pay that the Marine Corps will allow him to go, or to be paid. And so he hired him. What's fascinating about Ole May is he only stayed in for 7 years, and he got out.
Yeah, because his wife shot an officer, right?
Yeah, well, no, yeah, it was really crazy. I just wrote an article in the ITA journal about this. His wife was crazy. She started having an affair with another guy in the Marine band, and of course, according to the rules of the Marine Corps and the Naval Service, you can't do that. Adultery is part of the UCMJ. You can't have that. And so Ole May found out about it, and he went to William Santelmann, who was the director of the band. He said, I want you to go to this guy. His name was Conan. Can't remember his first name. Last name Conan. And he basically said, I want you to go to Conan. I want you to break it off. Tell him to break it off. And so he did that. So Conan wrote this letter to Ole May's wife. Ole May's wife went crazy and actually waited for him as Lucius is his first name. Lucius Conan was heading back from a concert at the Capitol building in uniform, back to the Marine barracks. And it happened right on 7th Street next to the barracks there in Southeast. You can go right on the corner there. The newspapers are very specific where it happened. She waited for him, and she shot him in the back with a snub-nosed revolver. This is like a movie, She shot him in the back, and the bullet lodged right next to his...
Oh, wait. And, so my computer just froze, so I don't know if I caught that. The bullet lodged right in his...
The bullet lodged right in his spine.
Spine.
Yeah, his spine. Nowhere below that, Chris. I know.
It was, on my end, it was quite the cliffhanger. I'll see if I can leave that in the podcast. But it lodged right in his...
Yeah, and continue next week.
Yeah.
Right. But so it lodged in his spine, and they took him to the Naval Hospital. Like I said, it's still standing there. And what's hilarious is that the May's house was right across the street from the hospital. So Jenny May was arrested, but Ole May bailed her out. But she had to go home and look right across the street and see the room where the guy she shot was. It was right there. I mean, and they give the address of their house, and you can go see the row home is still there. I've seen it, and it's literally. Of course, the street is like half the size of a normal street. So, I mean, she's almost at the front step of the hospital, which must have been so bizarre. Well, the court case was huge news because D.C. is federal government. It's not state government. So this was a federal murder investigation. So it was front page news on all the papers. And of course they had a picture of Ole May's wife, Jenny, in the middle. And then one picture of Ole May in his band uniform with his double bell euphonium on one side and Lucius Conin on the other side, he played French horn and he played fiddle. So it's a love triangle. On the front page of, I mean, just imagine that in the Washington Post today. But it shows you how influential and how popular the Marine Band was at the time that would make front page news.
Yeah.
Of course, it was a salacious trial, and a lot of the details of the affair came up, which was very embarrassing. And what happened was that Lucius Conin lasted for like a year and 2 weeks, and in order to get a murder conviction, he had to die within a year. And so she beat the murder conviction, but she ended up getting, I think, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, something like that. But she got 10 years in federal prison, not state prison, federal prison.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So basically, I imagine, and that happened in 1906. And what's crazy to me is that all this time when this is happening, according to all the programs that I found from the Marine Band library, Ole May is still soloing like 19, 20 times in a summer. Wow. I mean, he's got a full, very busy soloing schedule, and he's top billing too. William Santelmann gave him top billing on all of the press releases for the Marine Band. It's always Ole May, euphonium, playing different polkas and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, and he played at the New York Hippodrome like the same year that his wife got arrested, got sentenced. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, the stress. I mean, I think he had 4 or 5 kids at home too.
Wow.
So I can't imagine how he was able to produce at that level, considering and plus, your coworker just got shot by your wife. I mean, what are the other people that you're working with are thinking,
Yeah.
Anyway, so he finally left in 1907, not 2007. 1907. I imagine it was just because he's like, look, I have to get out of here. Yeah. And he moved to Pittsburgh. I think he stopped playing for a while there, and then he eventually started playing in a band in Cleveland. He moved back to Cleveland. And what's interesting is Arthur Pryor loved his playing, and he always wanted to get him to play with his band in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And one summer, the summer of 1907 or 1917 rather, he finally got him to sub in with some concerts that summer at Asbury Park, because Simon Manti had just left to play with the Metropolitan Opera. He had left band playing to be a trombonist with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. And so Ole May went, and after I think the 3rd or 4th concert, he went on a drive like at midnight in one of the cornet players' convertible Cadillacs that he had. And of course, back then there were no seatbelts. And so they were driving, and there was different reports on what happened, but the driver was this cornet player who said that the wind blew his spectacles off of his face, his glasses. He lost control of the vehicle, and they actually jackknifed a street lamp, and it basically tore the car in half. And Ole May was thrown from the vehicle, and he died of his injuries pretty soon after. But Arthur Pryor felt so guilty about it that he paid for all of the funeral arrangements and had the body shipped back to Cleveland, where it's buried today. Yeah, wow. But Ole May, I mean, what a great talent. And really after him, we didn't really get a great euphonium soloist. We had some good ones like Donald Kimball in the World War II years was great, but a really fine, prolific soloist we didn't get until Arthur Lehman came in the 1950s. Yeah, that was a tangent. I don't know if you wanted me to go there.
Yeah, no, you gotta have the love triangle story if we're talking about the double bell euphonium. So.
Yeah, I think we got off on the Italian effect on the double bell, but I think the Italians, their influence can't be understated. Of course, Stephen Canstrasi's right there, a great Italian euphonium player, and I've got Italian roots. So, and Chris Troiano, I think we've got 3 Italians here that are keeping the Italian blood alive in the the
Yeah,
euphonium.
my fiance's mother says that I'm a New York Italian, so it's not true Italian. It's a
And
fake
I'm kind
Italian.
of Pennsylvania Italian, so
Well,
it's
my Italian relatives went straight from Italy to Colorado of all places. So, I guess I'm a Colorado Italian. Does that
Yeah,
make
I
sense?
don't know. But we have the pizza, so you're
That's
good.
right.
yeah.
No pizza in Colorado. That's for dang.
Something that I still had um, a question about. I was reading a book by Kenneth Bernard called Lincoln and the Music of the Civil War,
Yes.
and it's basically, chronicling the Marine Band during
Yes.
those 4 or 5 year period.
Yes.
Uh, so it's been really interesting. But something that I noticed in that book is that the Marine Band needed to be ready at like the drop of a hat. Like they could all be at home and then like
Yeah.
get a phone call and they had
Well,
to
there was no
be at
phone
the one.
calls.
Oh yeah. Be there like in an hour. Like
Yes.
is there still that immediacy in the band now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, usually we try, I mean, the White House plans, events so, far enough in advance, but, but sometimes something will happen and, they need the band. And so,
What's
they,
what's the shortest notice that you've gotten?
hours,
Yeah.
a couple hours. And the thing is, we have repertoire ready to go, so
Mhm.
whatever they need, we can fill in that gap. If they need a jazz combo, usually it's like for a jazz combo. Sometimes it's for like a string ensemble to go over there, but we have a repertoire all ready to go. So
Mhm.
it's just plug and play. We can do that.
So how does that work? I know that you guys like have to go in for rehearsals, and then when you have Arlington Cemetery things, you're on a schedule for that kind of thing. But then
Yes.
for
Yeah, those are
these,
planned out months ahead.
but then for these things where it's where it can happen on much shorter notice, do you have guys that are on call during a certain time of the day, or are all four of you guys on call all the time, or how does that
Well,
work?
we're on call every day, except for weekends. What we call make jobs. It's kind of the informal title of it. But basically, from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., we have to be available to take a call and to get assigned a job.
Hmm.
Now, in my 18 years in the band, I have gotten called maybe twice saying, "Hey, a new thing just came in. You need to be ready today or tomorrow." But I'm a euphonium player, and I'm not, first call for White House jobs usually.
Hmm.
I mean, basically, the stuff that I do at the White House is usually on the outside. So whether it's a balcony band, or a band on the South Lawn, which we've been doing since the 1820s.
Hmm.
That's usually what the euphoniums are involved in. Though I say that, and Ryan McGeorge, one of the other euphonium players in the band, has played euphonium with the jazz combo in the White House before too. So that's been a really great development for the euphonium as well. But yeah, so we are on call, and like I said, it's usually going to be the piano players, it's going to be the string players, it's going to be the jazz guys that do the jazz combo stuff, because that's that's a lot of the music they want. They want just background music,
Yeah. They're not
for
calling for those opera transcriptions anymore. Right?
well, I mean, if they wanted that, we could do that for them. But I mean, it's mainly, if they have a cocktail party, or if they have a impromptu, bill signing or something like that, then they want to have that kind of background stuff there to kind of just liven up the event and to make it smooth and to make it, look and feel good to those who come, and for the press too,
Hmm.
The band has been used at times to distract the press. I don't know if I should get into that story, but
But here we go.
well, I should probably demur, because this is going to
Okay.
be going out. But
Yeah, that's fine.
there's a lot of stories you can actually look up on the internet, and actually on the Marine Band website, that do tell a lot of really great stories about the president and the Marine Band in terms of how we've been used over the years. If you want to talk a little bit about the band during the Civil War years or during the Lincoln administration, it's a really interesting time, because like I mentioned way back at the beginning of the interview, the band up until the 1860s was getting paid out of the pockets of officers. We had no, rank. I mean, there was no rank structure besides drum major and fife major. That was it, and even though we weren't playing fifes anymore, but it was Scala who basically petitioned Lincoln, President Lincoln, to help them and to standardize the pay, standardize the rank, all that kind of stuff that made Lincoln go to Congress, and Congress passed a resolution or an act in the 1860s. I can't remember the exact date.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe it was during the Civil War. Well, it had to have been because Lincoln was president.
Mm-hmm.
That basically gave the Marine Band the same pay structure as the West Point Army Band, which I think is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Because the West Point Band came into being in 1802, maybe 1805, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had the same pay structure. We actually had pay for the first time since our beginning, and we had rank. So that's when musician third, second, first class became a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that rank, the musician third, second, and first class, that stayed until the 20th century. I mean, I think up until like the 1930s, even they still had musician third, first, and second, and first class until I think the Marine Corps finally restructured it in the 1950s. I want to say it was that late.
Wow.
But maybe it was 1940s, like maybe or 30, or right just before World War II. It was around that mid 20th century time, but.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that happened because of Scala and because of Lincoln. And also, Scala he really, in his personal writings, he really liked Lincoln. He said Lincoln was very plain spoken. He was very friendly, and Lincoln loved the band. The person that really enjoyed the band, though, was their younger son, Willie.
Mm-hmm.
And a really kind of unfortunate thing that happened, the band is always trying to, keep itself relevant and always trying to give the chief executive what they want and what they need for events of state. And the band, Lincoln loved the band, Willie loved the band, Mary Todd Lincoln, the first lady, loved the band. And so they actually, I think in 1861 or 2, they had for the first time a concert of the Marine Band. I think it was inside the White House. And it was a dedicated concert to the Marine Band. They had refreshments. They invited guests, heads of state to this thing. And it was really kind of the Marine Band's time to shine, And what happened, though, was that Willie got sick about 2 weeks before he came down ill. And so the night of the concert, it ended up being a very low-key thing and something that really kind of fizzled because Mary Todd Lincoln wasn't even there. She kept going back upstairs to check on her son, who was sick. And really tragically, Willie died. He was 11 years old and he died. I can't remember what he died of. I'm sure you could look that up. But Mary Todd Lincoln was so distraught that she canceled all Marine Band concerts around the White House. At that point, we were playing concerts at the Lafayette Park across the street from the White House and on the South Lawn of the White House, weekly concerts. Mm-hmm. And she canceled all of them for indefinitely. So I don't know what the band did because we used to get paid extra for playing at the White House. And so I imagine it was a really lean time. And finally, after a year, I think it was, the people of DC were getting pretty dang angry that they couldn't have any Marine Band concerts. So finally, I think one of Lincoln's advisors said, you've got to start the concerts again. You've got to. So Lincoln approved them to start the Marine Band to start concerts, but just in Lafayette Park, not on the grounds of the White House. And I don't think they started again with the concerts on the grounds until after the Lincolns left office, until after the assassination.
Right.
The other thing that's really interesting about that is that when Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater, the guys in the pit and the guy leading the pit was William Withers, who used to be in the Marine Band, and the guy on double bass was Lewis Weber, who was the first euphonium player that I was able to, or saxophone player that I found.
Wow.
He was on double bass the night that it happened.
Yeah.
So they both witnessed it. And what happened was he said that there was an intermission, and I think it was Withers was backstage, and he was going back on to do something, and John Wilkes Booth brushed by him and knocked him over and stabbed him with a knife that he had, but it didn't penetrate his clothing, or it wasn't a mortal wound. But he went right past him, and because he said, that's John Wilkes Booth, it'd be like, hey, that's Tom Cruise,
Yeah.
It was, and he went out the door, and I think Booth swore at him or something like that. But William Withers, former Marine Band guy, had to testify at the trial.
Wow.
And what else is interesting is after the assassination, the federal government locked Ford's Theater down.
Mm-hmm.
And Lewis Weber mentioned that he had a double bass in there and he couldn't get his instrument out. They couldn't get their instruments out. In fact, Ford's Theater was dark. That was it. That was the last performance that Ford's Theater ever did.
Mm-hmm.
And it eventually became like an office building and like a federal office building for a while, until I think it was the 1950s or 60s when they started getting funds to refurbish it as a theater.
Yeah, I've seen videos of some Civil War bands giving performances on that stage, so I know that it was at least renovated or refurbished to.
Yeah, well, now it is. You can. I've gone and seen. I've seen. They have a Christmas Carol that goes every year there. It's a beautiful theater, and the box is still there where Lincoln sat. I mean, it's right there. You can.
They have like a banner on it or something.
Yeah, they've got flags and a picture and stuff like that. But I said that's fascinating that members of the Marine Band were there when he was assassinated.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And so, but Lincoln had a very
fitting, I guess.
Yeah. Lincoln had a very close association with the band. The most famous story, though, is that Lincoln asked the band to accompany him to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, when he dedicated the National Cemetery, which is where we get the Gettysburg Address.
Right.
In the actual notes of the program, of course, there's the famous guy that spoke for 3 hours that no one remembers his name. And then Lincoln gets up and speaks. Well, between them, it said all the commentary from the day said a band played a short air before the president got up. Now, there's no mention of what band it was. I can assume, though, that if it was the president of the United States, we might have been playing Hail to the Chief before he got up, or maybe it was the Marine Band playing something. We do know that the Marine Band led the procession into the cemetery of everybody before the ceremony started, playing the Old 100th, the Protestant Old 100th hymn, which I think is amazing. And colloquially, the story goes that on the way back, on a train ride, Lincoln got tired of dealing with all of his advisors about the war, and he made his way back to the train car where the band was, and he just hung out with the band. He conversed with the band, which I think is really great.
The band's always a good hang, so good choice.
Yeah, the band's always a good hang, and I think Lincoln, Lincoln, I think was a man of the people. I really do. I think he was very plain spoken, and I think I don't know. I think the band. I think that's probably why he liked the band, because the Marine Band was it still is to a large extent, just a blue collar musical organization, where it was a family business for, like I said before, for a lot of these guys. And, I think they were just down to earth people,
the band works hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What, Chris?
I said, except you guys have red collars.
Yeah. Right. Actually, they're black.
Oh.
They're black colors.
Can you explain the uniform real quick, in case people don't know why the Marine Band has a
wears
tradition
red?
of wearing red? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Really quickly,
the old guard wears red too.
Yes, yeah, and they should too. It's not because we're British or of British derivation, but back in the Civil War day or the Revolutionary War days, the musicians or field musics, as they were called, were the opposite colorations of the infantry troops. And so in the Marine Corps, the opposite, they used to wear dark blue with red piping. So the opposite, that would be a red or scarlet tunic with black or dark blue, piping on the outside or ornamentation. And that's the basic thing. That's the basic reason why we wear red. The old guard wears red, is because the field musics at the time wore the opposite colorations. It was also to denote non-combatants, which is, by the rules of war at the time, I don't think you could fire on a non-combatant, same as you couldn't fire on on a field medic. I don't know if that always panned out. You're wearing a giant red coat on a battlefield, but that was the rule of the time, I think.
I know
go ahead.
I know drummer boys were targeted during the Civil War at some point. So
yeah, they were targeted. The reason they were targeted is because on the battlefield there was no satellite uplink or cell phones or radio communication. So it was drum cadences and bugle calls were the only way of communication. So that's how officers would get the troops to do flanking maneuvers, in the field. Yeah. While the guns were shooting, you could hear a drum call to retreat or advance or flank. They have a million drum or bugle calls that you had to memorize as a soldier in order to being able to function on the battlefield well. And buglers had to memorize that too. In fact, as I mentioned before, during the apprentice music program, you had to memorize a certain amount of bugle calls. And the director of the Marine Band would test you on those calls. And if you passed that, then you would pass your apprenticeship. And if you couldn't do that, then you would not pass your apprenticeship. So,
but there's a bugle Boy Scout badge too. You can
Yeah. See, there you go.
memorize some bugle calls.
Well, there actually used to be in the Marine Corps a separate rank for bugler that had a trumpet under the chevron on the rank, a ring patch. So you don't have that anymore. So, yeah, in terms of Scala and the Lincolns, though, that was a really pivotal time for the band. And what's interesting too is after the Civil War, you know, there was a huge drawdown, especially with the bands. You know, bands were just getting canceled, you know, left and right. And decommissioned. And so one thing that came out of that was that the Marine Band one day after the Civil War went to it was New Year's Day. They just decided, or Scala decided, to go to the back porch of the commandant's home, which, if any of you have seen the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. in Southeast, it's a square city block, and on one side on a street is the commandant's home, and that's the oldest continuously lived in residence in DC. It dates to like 1803. And so in the 1860s, the commandant has always lived there. He still lives there to this day. The current commandant still lives there. So they went to the commandant's home on New Year's morning and they serenaded him. Surprise. It was a surprise serenade. So he comes out, they serenade him, which actually was quite common back then. They would do that. You usually would hire a band to do that. But they serenaded him. It was a surprise. He invited all the musicians in. They toasted with buttered rum. And it became a tradition. You know, we still do it to this day. Every New Year's Day, we did it this last New Year's Day. We come to, quote, it's a surprise. It's been happening for over 150 years. But the commandant still invites us in. They still toast. The director of the Marine Band and the commandant and all of his guests are there. They toast with a buttered rum. They drink it. It's brace. What is it? Brace the mainsail. Or they say a name. It's like brace the mainsail or something like that. I'm blanking on what they say. But it's a saying basically to drink up. And so they drink, and then they invite everybody in, and there's always a nice spread of food there. But what's fascinating to me is I think the reason that got started is because of all the drawdown. I think the Scala at the time was like, hey, let's go pay our good buddy, the commandant of the Marine Corps, a visit, and just remind him how relevant and good we sound, you know, and let's just do something nice for him. So if one of the bean counters in the War Department comes calling and saying, why do you have your own band? He can say, oh, they're great. Just leave it.
Purely
It seemed like that was
self-preservation.
it seemed like that was a trend. We talked about, Chris, was it the 26th North Carolina band? Or that when the order came down during the Civil War to kind of reform the regimental brass bands into the brigade brass bands, they were so deep. Or it was a Union band.
That was the Port Royal band.
Yeah, they were so deep in Confederate territory, and they had made themselves a fixture of the town that because they had made themselves important, they were able to then stick around and just kind of be renamed. So it's make yourself important, and they'll let you stay.
Yeah. So I think it was a pretty shrewd move with from Scala and right after the Civil War to do that. And like I said, we still do it. And I think it's still important because, the commandant of the Marine Corps, he doesn't get to hear us, even though he lives at the barracks. He doesn't work at the barracks because the barracks is not the center of the Marine Corps anymore. The Quantico is the headquarters of the Marine Corps in Virginia. So he doesn't really get to hear the band all that much. And it's a chance for us to show him, that we're there, that we support him, and that, we're sounding great. And that we're still doing our major function, and we're still providing the music that we have for over 200 years. And it's, like I said, it's funny because it still serves the same function it did 150 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's neat.
And then I also know Scala was responsible for upsizing the band. And I think he, in that Bernard book, I think it said he like tripled the number of musicians.
Yeah, well, that was probably Lincoln too. That he talked to Congress and to Lincoln that did that. Yeah, the band size has fluctuated throughout the years. Even though they were saved after the Civil War in the 1870s, they almost got disbanded. It came close. But they were really, instead of that, the compromise was they really got reduced in number. And I think by the time Sousa came in 1880, they only had, I think maybe, in the 20s, maybe 30, maybe 32, 34, something like that. It was small. And during Sousa's time, they were able to get some more musicians. But the real big coup happened in 1900 or 1901 during the McKinley administration. William Santelmann he really wheeled and dealed, and he almost doubled the size of the band. And what's interesting there is that because he was German, the two things that happened was, and this really ties into the brass band thing, because most of the the band directors in the Marine Band were Italian during the 19th century, the slide trombone wasn't used quite as much. I think they did have slide trombones, but the person that would always play the first chair trombone player, the first part trombone, was always a valve trombonist, always. Mm-hmm. I think that was even through the Sousa years, though I might be mistaken on that. But I do know that I read one newspaper article about one of the Marine Band trombone soloists at the turn of the century that did say that he was the first principal trombonist of the Marine Band to do so on slide trombone rather than valve trombone.
Interesting.
And I think one thing that's interesting in the evolution of the euphonium in the Marine Band is I think a lot of the guys that ended up on playing baritone, because it was definitely a doubler's instrument, were guys that were on the valve trombone first. And I think that's another reason why I think Italians found it very easy to play the euphonium, the double bell euphonium, because that's not an Italian instrument. I don't think it wasn't in the 1890s by that point, is because they were playing a valve trombone in Italian bands. Because slide trombone in Italy wasn't a thing. That was a German instrument. It was not an Italian instrument. Valve trombone was much more Italian. And so I think the Marine Band didn't really use a slide trombone until the 1890s, full time. But anyway, I got off topic. What were we talking about? What was the original question again? I'm blanking on I went on a tangent now. I forgot where we were going.
It's okay. It's an episode of tangents. It's great though. It's good.
Yeah,
it's good
but
size of Scala's band and
size of Scala's band. Yeah. So I think it did get larger and larger. What I was going to say was that when William Santelmann got the larger band, he actually expanded the euphonium section. So there was one euphonium, there was two baritones and two tenor horns. But they're not the brass band tenor horns. They were like basically the tenor sax horn, but they were upright, because he wanted that full German, brass section.
For sure.
And so he brought in guys like, there's a guy named Giuseppe Molino he brought in. Giuseppe Molino was a valve trombone player, Italian, that he brought over on tenor horn into the band. And John E. Esputa, who was the son of another John Esputa who'd been in the band, who was actually John Philip Sousa's music teacher. And he also had his own brass band, John Esputa did. So those two guys came in the band. They got out pretty quickly because the whole tenor horn thing, it just went away. I think they just didn't need that many euphoniums in the band.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting. So the size of the band has steadily increased. We have over 170 musicians now, or around roughly 160. Then support staff, it's about 170. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's accounting for the strings and jazz complement and stuff.
Yeah. Well, most of the jazz guys are either in the string orchestra or they're members of the band, but they double in jazz too.
That's not its own billet.
No,
that's a doublers ensemble.
Yeah, we're still, even though with 107, we're still the smallest band and organization of all the services. So after World War I, you get the Navy band comes, the Army band comes, and then after World War II, the Air Force band comes. And I think the Coast Guard band came after that. No, the Coast Guard band came in the 30s, I think, because I think John Philip Sousa had a part in that somehow. Anyway, so then but then in the 70s, all these bands really expanded. And that's when they started with choruses, and they started with jazz bands like the Army Blues and the Airmen of Note and the Commodores and all these guys. The Navy and the Army just expanded, and the Air Force expanded, and they had all these different separate ensembles within the quote unquote band umbrella organization. And the Marine Band we've always done what we've done in the past, which is we used to just have doublers. So all the guys in the band would double on string instruments. So when the White House needed an orchestra, they were essentially getting the same players, but they were on string instruments. But in the 50s, we realized that the level that you could get with doublers just wasn't high enough. So we started, we stopped that policy. And we started hiring, dedicated string players, no more doubling. So, but even then, the only differentiation in the band is string orchestra and band. That's it. All the other players that play with the orchestra or the jazz or any other ensemble we do, which is a lot, they're all just members of the band that double, that can do other things. We sent mariachi bands over there. We've sent Latin jazz bands over there. We've sent a Muslim or Islamic folk ensemble to the White House, Irish band. It just doesn't matter. Whatever they want, we find the people that can do it. And that's just how we've rolled. And because plus the Marine Corps is the smallest of all the branches, you know, and so we kind of are commensurate with that size, I guess. Few the proud, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So I mean, you know, that's just kind of how our tradition has continued to go. And the euphonium section has also gone up and down in terms of numbers. As late as the 1980s, there was only 3. And that made it really difficult when the band would go on tour, because there would be only one euphonium left. We have to do all the jobs, you know, because we leave on tour and half the band stays. So they finally got, when Luke Spiros retired in the 1980s, we finally got 4 guys back. So that makes it a lot easier. So 2 can go on tour, 2 can stay, and you know, it makes the divvying up of jobs a lot more even and a lot more manageable in terms of numbers. And that bill has never gone away since.
You go on tour twice a year? Just
once, yeah. Once. October, yeah.
I thought there was a spring tour also.
No, that's I think the Air Force Band does that. Of course, the Army Field Band does 3 of those or 4 of those. But
gotcha.
Yeah, we just do one. We've always just done one. It used to be in the spring, and then it moved to the fall, and it used to be 9 weeks every day, no breaks, twice a day, two performances a day.
Right.
And that was mainly because it used to be a moneymaker for the band back in the old days, you know, so they had to make money. They did as many concerts as they could. But then when the federal government came in and said, no, you can't be doing that, you're a military unit, we'll basically cover it. And then if sponsors can cover your expenses, we'll pay you your normal rate. Then that changed the game, so we didn't have to do so many concerts. So when I got in, it was 7 weeks. And then in 2006, 2007, I think it was, that's when it got changed to 4 weeks, which, everyone was so happy. We were just like, it's great. Because 7 weeks on the road is, it's a lot. Especially when you got a family and kids, it's rough.
Yeah, I'm sure. It reminds me of something also I read in that Bernard book that in 1861, Napoleon's nephew, Prince Napoleon, came to the capital, and the Marine Band played a concert. They did their typical afternoon concert at the White House, and then left from that full concert, went right inside, and then started playing for the party, you know, the gala being thrown for Napoleon, and they played until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So like nonstop playing from the afternoon to 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. You know, I mean, that's just what they did. I mean, granted, the music they were playing was probably not as taxing as, you know, the music we play now, but it's still playing, and, you know, chops wear out. I don't know how they did that. I mean, they may have had smaller ensembles, you know, break out or something. I don't know what they did, but I mean, the fact that the Marine Band has been the president's own since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, you know, has meant that we can do, in terms of repertoire, we can do a lot. And also because of the tradition that I just talked about with the Italian and German bandmasters. You know, when Santelmann came in, and, you know, he was a baritone player who became the director after Francisco Fanciulli, who's the guy that replaced Sousa, got fired. And the reason he got fired is because he refused to play a Sousa march, by the way. They fired him. And so Santelmann came in, and he was German. He came in German. And he's actually a really interesting story too. He was in Germany. He was trained in Germany as a violinist, and he also had played baritone. But he came over with a traveling orchestra that used to play outside of Philadelphia. Apparently, there used to be an island in the middle of the Delaware River that had a big park on it, and you could take ferries from Philadelphia, and people would have picnics there and band and orchestra concerts on this island. I can't remember what the island's name was, but they eventually they did away with it, so there's no more island there. But they used to play on this island, and Santelmann would come over with his orchestra playing violin, and he met a girl there in Philadelphia, an American girl, and wanted to marry her. And he didn't know what to do, and so he actually met a guy who used to come to the concerts who was John Distin's son in one of the famous Distin quartets. So after he sold the business, I can't remember his name, the son, I'm blanking on his name, so many names and dates to remember, but after the Distin family sold the Distin instrument company to Boozy in the 1860s, Distin came to America to open up his own factory, and he started in Philadelphia. And he eventually went to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, out west, but in the west part of the state. But anyway, so Santelmann met Distin. And Distin told him, look, if you want to stay in the States and marry this girl, you got to go to John Philip Sousa down the Marine Band. They're hiring. You play baritone and fiddle, which is great, and you should go audition for him.
Yeah, wow.
So he took a train down to Washington, D.C. This is in the 1886 time period. And he said he got to Marine Barracks there, and Sousa was out hunting, believe it or not. You could still hunt around D.C. And he came back, and he'd had the pheasants and rabbits that he'd shot, and he put them down. You know, he really gotten lucky that day. And then he listened to an audition. So then he listened, and he said I think he played clarinet, baritone, and violin. You know, he played 3 different instruments.
There you go.
And what's fascinating about Santelmann, the first violin he ever played, he made himself. He built himself a violin in Germany. Yes, he built himself a violin.
I'm gonna build a euphonium and use it on my audition for the Marine Band. Next time.
I'm sure it'll go really well. I don't think that was the violin he used for his audition, thank heaven.
Okay,
but
well, I'm still gonna do that.
He was using pine tree sap for rosin or something like that. But anyway, so he played, and of course, Santelmann or Sousa really liked him, but he said, "Look, I don't have an opening right now for a first-class musician. I only have a third-class spot." So if you're willing to take it, I can do that. And then as soon as that position opens up, I'll give you the first class position because that's higher pay. So that's what happened. So I think he was making something like $13 a month or something ridiculous like that. And he got on, he married the girl. They moved down to Washington, and he became a member of the band on clarinet mainly, but he also doubled on baritone when they needed it. And of course, obviously violin. But and he was very loyal to Sousa, but when Sousa retired in 1892, he did not like Fanciulli, and he left the band pretty quickly after Fanciulli came in as director. And then when Fanciulli got fired, they appointed William Santelmann, who at that point had already started being a director of orchestras in the local theater scene in D.C. They appointed him to be the next director of the band, the 19th director of the band. And he was director of the band until 1929, I think. Or no, 1932 even, I think it was. 1932 maybe? I think it's pretty close. He's the longest tenured band director we've had in the Marine Band. And like I said, he did a lot for the band. But a really interesting story with that guy, and interesting on how he met the Distins and kind of how he worked into the overall history of the euphonium in general. So
yeah, that's amazing. And then I know I guess the very last thing is that whenever you guys do your March Madness bracket with the Marine Band, I don't know if it's every year, but a good number of the years I see Scala's Union/inauguration
March. Yes. That's another thing about the Lincoln year is we found a photo. This is some years back. We found a photo of Lincoln's second inaugural. It's on the east side, east or west side of the Capitol. Maybe it's the west side of the Capitol. It's the one that's not facing the mall, the opposite one. That's where all the inaugurations used to happen. But it shows Lincoln. You can see Lincoln at the podium, I think, and you can see the huge, platform they'd built and everything like that. You can still see the scaffolding on the dome that wasn't quite finished on the Capitol building. And one of our librarians at the time said, I wonder if the Marine Band was there, because we tout ourselves as having played if most of the inaugurations of every president since Thomas Jefferson. We know that we played his first inauguration, and we're pretty sure we played everyone since then. So he started getting a magnifying glass and looking at this picture, and sure enough, off to the right of the presidential lectern, you can see the backward bell of a sax horn sticking out. And he's like, there we are, right awesome. There. It's awesome.
Bingo.
Very cool.
And that was probably one of the earliest, well, it's certainly the earliest inaugural photo we have of the band. And it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, photos of the band, because we do have one of the band standing in front of the commandant's house at Marine Barracks, Washington, on the parade deck there at the barracks, which is dated to the Civil War time, but not at the inauguration of President Lincoln. So we were really lucky to see that.
I like how you say a photo of the band. Meanwhile, it's just a bell sticking out of a crowd of people.
Well, I mean, it's a bell sticking out of a crowd of people on the lectern next to the President of the United States. So it's a pretty good chance that it's the Marine Band.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that in terms of the Union March, we played that off and on. We had a brand new arrangement done when we did the Library of Congress concert, like I think it was 2013. We did that.
Yeah, we're gonna put a link up to that on
it was really great.
on our website.
Yeah, the guy, he lectured about Scala. He did a really nice job. He's done a couple of our concerts. He's a really, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's a really, really knowledgeable guy, and he's a great storyteller. And so it makes it really entertaining. But part of the Union March is we have to yell in the middle of it, "Hurrah for the Union!"
Yeah.
And depending on how the players of the band feel that day, the hurrah is more or less, enthusiastic. Yeah. But it's, it was great because you have to remember too, at that time, the march as we know it as a type of music, it really American march hadn't really coalesced yet.
Sousa wasn't there yet.
Sousa was he was a kid, his father was there, but he was a kid, and just the type of march that we identify as American, hadn't really been developed yet. And Scala actually was really instrumental in developing that style, of a march separate from a larger classical work, a march that is not, is as American. It's not German. It's not an English march we're playing, or a German march, or a French. It's an American march. It's an original composition on American soil. Mm-hmm. And so his marches, even though they're not Sousa marches, they're not great, but they were good for the time, and they served a function, and they were a basis for a lot of other guys that came after him, including Sousa, because Sousa was there. He heard those marches. He studied with guys that were in the band with Scala. With John Esputa was in the band with Scala, and John Esputa was Sousa's first music teacher. So I mean, it was all things that were in Sousa's ear when Sousa started writing his marches. Mm-hmm. So, and Scala lived till 1903, so Sousa knew him. I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure.
He met him, and he lived in D.C. till he died. So he knew Scala. I'm sure he met the man several times, and I'm sure they shared stuff. So
yeah, very influential.
Did you want to talk about Hail to the Chief? That was one of the other questions that you emailed me. Is the Hail to the Chief?
Yeah, if you want to.
Yeah, Hail to the Chief is interesting because it started out as a kind of incidental music, part of like I think it was part of like a larger show or something like that. They said it might be derived from an old Gaelic air, but it was written by a guy named James Sanderson, and it was incidental music to a dramatic adaptation. Oh yeah, Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake poem. So someone made an adaptation, like a play of it, and they had some incidental music. And Hail to the Chief, I think it was a chief of like a clan, like a Scottish clan or something that came, Highland chieftain. But anyway, it was a popular tune, and the band played it. The first time the band played it was in 1829 for President Andrew Jackson when the C&O Canal opened up in Washington, D.C., which is the canal that runs alongside the Potomac River. And I think isn't that the canal? Maybe it's a different one. Now I'm doubting my knowledge here, but anyway, it was a popular tune of the day. But really, two first ladies are credited for getting it to be the official honor for the president. The first one was Julia Tyler, wife of President Tyler, who was president from 1841 to 1845. She wanted the Marine Band to play it just to announce her husband because she liked the music. The second one's funnier. It's Sarah Polk, who was the first lady, wife of James K. Polk, who succeeded Tyler from 1845 to 1849. She wanted it because Polk apparently was very short. And when he would come into a room, no one would notice him. And so she wanted some music to basically announce that he was coming so everyone would have to stop what they're doing and watch them. But eventually it became, the official or unofficial presidential honors. Mm-hmm. It kind of lost favor when Sousa was the president or was the leader of the band. I don't know if it was Sousa that initiated this conversation or the president, but one of them said to the other, I don't like this piece, or can you do something better? Maybe it was the president. This might have been Grover Cleveland or one of the 1880s presidents. And so Sousa said, yeah, I'll write something. So he wrote what's called the Presidential Polonaise. And they used it for a while, but it never caught on. So Hail to the Chief kind of came back, and that's what it's been ever since. And Presidential Polonaise is actually a piece we've played before, but it never became the new Hail to the Chief, unfortunately.
That's not what's used for the vice president now, is it?
No, that's Hail Columbia.
Hail Columbia.
Hail Columbia.
Oh, okay. We know Hail Columbia.
Yeah. Yeah, it's again a very popular tune at the time, and I mean the national anthem was a popular tune at the time before it got used as the anthem. But so that, and it's become the official military honors for the commander in chief. Each branch of each level of command in the military has a different tune. So if you're a flag officer in the Army, you get a flag officer's march. If you're a Army officer, you get a general officer's march, which is different. If you're a member of Congress, or then you get Stars and Stripes Forever, last strain of Stars and Stripes Forever. Again, vice president gets Hail Columbia. So it depends on what rank you are in terms of your presidential honors, or your military honors rather. But yeah, that's kind of the short story of Hail to the Chief. We do revels and flourishes at the beginning of that, which is dun da dun da dum dum da dum da dum. For the president, it's 4, and for 4-star generals, there's 4. 3-star generals get 3 of those repeated, and 2-star generals, 1 star goes down to 1, depending on your rank. I think members of Congress do get 4.
Does the VP get any?
Yeah, they get 4. And the revels and flourishes dates back all the way to the Navy, like in the 1830s, I think, when they just basically said naval regulations, whenever the president shows up, you have to give a ruffle on the drums. And that kind of evolved into, dun da dun da dun, this little very short fanfare, that you could repeat however many times, depending on their rank. It wasn't until the McKinley administration, I think, in the early 20th century, that he got both ruffles and flourishes and Hail to the Chief, and that became the official military honors that the band has done ever since.
Yeah, so I had known that the Hail to the Chief was utilized already by the time Lincoln was in office. They were referencing Scala's Marine Band, playing that every time. No, it was definitely used, but it was, a lot of things were unofficial, in the early days, and then they eventually coalesced into, actually official military regulation. If you ever go back and look at the inauguration ceremonies, we don't play Hail to the Chief for the new president until after he's sworn in. And we do that. We do 4 ruffles and flourishes and Hail to the Chief after they're sworn in, and they get a cannon volley, and that is the official music. I mean, it's a musical way of denoting they have just been given military authority. Command. I mean, that's a musical recognition of the military of the United States saying, you are now the commander in chief of the entire United States military. And the Marine Band has done that, for over 200 years, 220 years. And I think that's just amazing.
Yeah, I never thought of it particularly in that way.
I mean,
it's the military authority way.
Yeah, I mean, he is the commander in chief and of all of the armed forces. And of course, our founders were very wise to put a civilian over all that, And so when he's given that authority after he takes the oath of office, I mean, instantly that song is played because he is now the head of all armed forces in the United States. And it's a powerful moment. It's a silly little tune to, bum, 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 ba-dum, 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 ba-da. But that tune, boy, it
carries a lot of weight now.
It carries a lot of weight. And especially when, you're a kid that grew up in Nevada sitting on the lectern, looking up and seeing the president right there, less than 7 feet away from you, and he was just taking that oath with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And then you look to your left and you see the entire mall filled with people, and you're in the same uniform that Scala wore. Yeah. I mean, playing the same music at the same moment. Yeah. That's a pretty powerful thing. I mean, I that's not been lost on me, let me tell you. Yeah. I think when President Obama got inaugurated for the first time in 2009, of course, the mall was absolutely packed. I mean,
was that your first inauguration?
No, George W. Bush's second was my first. So I got in 2002. His second inauguration was 2005. So, but I mean, I have never seen that many people, and I will never see that many people again. I mean, I think there were people in the trees. I swear, it was just it was stunning how many people there were, and it was cold. It was really cold, and they were there, and I remember just, and of course the security was so tight. Yeah. They basically shut all the bridges down, so we all had to sleep at the barracks. We couldn't go home. Wow. And we the day started at 4 a.m. We were there all ready to go at 4 a.m. We waited and waited and waited. We got these badges so we could go through this layer after layer after layer of security. I mean, amazing security. And we just get ushered through these little hallways around the Capitol building, and then you're up on that stand that they build every 4 years. I mean, you're there. Yeah. And what's interesting is that the only reason that Mark Jenkins, euphonium player from Las Vegas, Nevada, is being allowed in that place at that time is because I am wearing that uniform, and because people like Scala have led the way and have paved the way with fantastic music and tradition for 200 years. Mm-hmm. The Marine Band always plays the inauguration, always. Yeah. And so, that's amazing. I'm sitting in the same spot as countless generations of men and women who have done what I'm doing. And boy, what a special feeling. And I mean, I'll use the word sacred even, in terms of an American, yeah. In America, we don't get the huge histories like our allies over the ocean, like England and France and Germany, their great histories back in the Middle Ages and things. We don't get that. Yeah. But we do get this, this is one thing that it's special for us. And it's something that we can do that in some ways they couldn't do for a lot of years, which is the peaceful transfer of power. And the fact that the Marine Band is so instrumental, no pun intended, I guess pun intended there, in that process is amazing to me. It's amazing. So yeah, it's a great history. And of course, the Marine Band played such a great part in the euphonium's evolution. I mean, if the Marine Band hadn't been, there, perfect examples, after Sousa died in 1932, I mean, the bands were done. And the touring bands around the country, it was over. That had passed. Jazz had completely, and blues had completely taken its place in terms of popular music. I mean, it was a huge turn. And of course, a lot of the early blues and ragtime, at least the song formats, took a lot from the bands. The early ragtimes from Scott Joplin, if you look at them, they're in the exact format of a Sousa march. I mean, down to the number of measures. Yeah, well. And so, but even with that, bands were done. And because the Marine Band was a military unit and it had a military function on top of its function of state at the White House, and then of course it's just its concertizing, we had federal funding and we could keep going. Mm-hmm. So we outlived the commercial ensembles that just went away. Yeah, yeah. And in the 1970s, when the American military graduated from a draft heavy, a volunteer, well, it was still volunteer, but in terms of a fighting force, a professional fighting force that trained people and kept people for a career versus, using people with the draft and then releasing them after 4 years of service or whatever, or less. The pay got way better. The benefits got way better. The GI Bill came into being. And so all of a sudden, now the military was a very viable career path for really fine musicians to consider, on par with a symphony orchestra. Mm-hmm. And so then that changed the game again. And again, the Marine Band was the first, and the oldest, and had the history and had the place in the White House, and because of that has been, present at all these great events in the nation's history. And so that brings prestige, it brings notoriety, and it helps the instruments in the band because it takes that along with it. And one of those instruments has always been the euphonium.
I guess the military academy at West Point and the Naval Academy, both of their bands probably have like similar histories, but I guess
yes,
not being at the exact center of things here in the nation's capital. I guess maybe to a lesser extent we're able to contribute to like the development of instrumentation in ensembles. and stuff like that. But I'm assuming, right, that those were the three bands that were around during that time period: the Marine Band, the West Point Military
Yeah.
Academy Band, and the Naval Academy Band.
Yeah, well, the West Point band started, I think, like I said before, I think it was like 1805, and I think the Naval Academy was like in the 1820s or 30s. But yeah, those are the two second and third oldest bands. And what's interesting is John Prosperi, who is the second earliest euphonium player that I found. Well, he played baritone. I know he's marketed as playing baritone. He actually left the Marine Band and went and joined the Naval Academy Band. And at that point, the Naval Academy Band, they weren't even enlisted. They were just a regular group of civilians that were called the Naval Academy Band. It wasn't until later that they actually had to be in the Navy to be in the Academy Band. He played in that group for quite a long time before he retired. But yeah, so those two were very important. And like I said, the West Point Band was very important because they were probably the first actually regularly paid band in the service, because they certainly were before the Marine Band was, because we took their model when we got reorganized and got actual pay from the U.S. government instead of just pocket change from Marine Corps officers. But yeah, and I'm sure that they've left their mark as well. All military ensembles have left their mark, because again, we were able to take the momentum that Sousa created when with his band that finally went away, and keep propelling that during the World War II years and even into the Korea years, with the surge in patriotism and nationalism that really started surging in the 1890s. After the Civil War in the 1880s and 90s, that's when American nationalism really started to go crazy. And of course, Sousa just rode that wave. All the bands rode that wave, and the military bands rode that wave. And that lasted all the way up until really Vietnam. And I'm not a super historian here, but that really, it was part of American life. Flag waving, it was just, America is good. America is a good thing in the world, and our bands reflect that. And World War I and World War II, those were pretty clear conflicts. World War I less so, but World War II especially, we knew what we were fighting for. We knew we were going against a force that had to be defeated. We had to defeat them. And we knew we were in the right. And so the bands we played into that, and we played into this. We're all in this together. It's a very difficult fight. We have to make a lot of sacrifices in order to win this. And the bands were right there, helping to articulate that. And going into Korea and Vietnam, the bands were there, but unfortunately during Vietnam especially, the military got painted in such a bad role. And that was, that's just what happened. And it's funny because I talked to all these euphonium players that are still alive that were in there at that time. And they really, I think they felt it, they felt, even though that people would still come to the concerts and stuff like that, the military took a hit, and nationalism took a hit during that time, that it didn't really start coming back until the Reagan years. I think is really the 80s is when it kind of maybe resurfaced a little bit.
Well, to bring everything full circle, I know there's a book that I've read called Troubled Commemoration. I think it's by Robert Cook. I could be wrong about that, but that book discusses the as the Civil War centennial was approaching in 1961, they were a lot of different groups kind of disagreeing on what the commemoration should focus on.
Right.
And Ulysses S. Grant III was actually a part of the congressional committee to help create or solidify the commemoration for the centennial. But
Sure.
It started focusing on, and they started getting a good idea of what they wanted it to be, to focus on American patriotism amidst all the wars that you were just saying.
Yeah,
Vietnam. All the discourse with communism. So they wanted the American Civil War centennial in 1961 to be that resurgence of American patriotism, and then that's when a lot of Civil War brass bands started getting reactivated and recreated, and this idea of early American brass bands in the modern era kind of started out of this idea of wanting to rekindle that patriotism that was lost in that 20-year period.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was that is interesting. Yeah, it really was a hit, and like I said, the military bands, we got through it fine. The bicentenary, helped in 1976, and then again, just the Reagan years in the 80s, we helped a lot. The economy was great. Our military seemed, very strong, and then of course when the Soviet Union fell, which I remember very well. That was a huge thing. And again, a huge resurgence of, I think, patriotism that helped. And I think it's still alive today. The question again is, the Marine band is not a reenactor band, like a lot of the brass bands. We're not. We are the same band that has been around since, 1798, and we do the same thing we've been doing. We wear the same uniforms we've been wearing, And
it's not a costume.
It's not a costume; it's a military uniform, and so, the question of is the concert band still relevant today? Is that a form of music in the musical culture, capital C culture, that is still relevant? We ask ourselves a lot, when we go on tour, to these towns, we wonder if there's a lot of times, most of the times, the theaters are full. But sometimes we go and the theaters aren't as full, not that they're empty, but we wonder, is like, okay, is this a sign? I don't know. Is this a generational thing? But at the same time, I'm sorry, but there's no age group that can't love a Sousa march, and there's no age group that can't be interested in an ensemble that's been around that is as long as ours has. And on top of that, I'm just talking about the concertizing. On top of that, the real reason I think that groups like the Marine Band have survived is that we have a functionality, a military functionality, and of doing funerals at Arlington Cemetery, of doing military ceremonies. And of course, the funerals at Arlington Cemetery are the most sacred things that we do. I've done hundreds of them. Yeah. It never gets old for me. It never does, because I every time I feel like I'm freezing my butt off here, I don't want to be in 34-degree weather playing a euphonium in the middle of a field or a cemetery. I look over and there's that family. They have tears streaming down their face, whether it's an active duty Marine that's died, or whether it's a guy who served 30 years ago in Vietnam, or more than that. Vietnam's more than 30 years ago now. Geez. But who left the service 30 years ago, who did serve in Vietnam, or who served in the Gulf War, in 91, and has died, and his family's there, or a guy who they've just gotten his remains back from Peleliu in the South Pacific, who died in World War II. Those, it's like, that is the greatest honor that we can pay those people, those Marines that died, men and women. And it's also the greatest honor, since those people are departed. We can honor their families by showing them that the Marine Band still values their sacrifice, their family member sacrifice, and we're going to show you through our music, and we're going to play it the best we can. And I tell you, that's something that will always make military bands in America relevant. Administrations come and administrations go, but the Marine Band is a constant. And it's always amazing to see a new administration come in, because they're always like, now, what do you guys do? Because some of them have never been in D.C. before, like, President Obama had never been in D.C. I mean, he was a senator, but he I'm sure he'd seen the band in passing, but, unless you're at the White House a lot. And of course, President Trump, he wasn't in Washington, D.C. So they're always like, now, what do you guys do? How do you fit into this? And then we show them, well, look, we can do anything you want us to do. And we can do any musical support you want. Yeah. They're like, really? Wait, you can do this? And we're like, yeah, here, let me show you. Wait, you can do this? Yeah, you can play drum set when I'm doing a rap with what's the guy named who did Hamilton? Miranda.
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Miranda, yeah. So you can play. One of your guys can play drum set while President Obama, does a makeup rap with Miranda on the South Lawn. You can do that. And we're like, yes. And their mind is blown. They're like, oh, well, okay then. Well, we will use you. We will definitely use you. And so it's amazing to see how each administration kind of warms to the band when they realized, we're there for them. We're there to support them and the office, and we're there to make them look good. We're there to make a bill signing, a cocktail party work. Perfect example. There's a great story when the prime minister, or was the president of France, one of the two, maybe it was the president. I think it's the president. He came over during early during Trump's administration for a state dinner. And of course, what happens is that the president, the orchestra of the Marine Band is there in the grand foyer. The president walks down with the first lady to the front door. The president of France is there with his wife. They meet, and they're supposed to, the band is, or the orchestra is just supposed to play traveling music as they walk past the orchestra into the elevators up to the private area to have their dinner. And well, that didn't happen this time. So again, President Trump is pretty new. So he brought the French president over to the orchestra to listen to the music. And I can't remember, I don't know what music they were playing at the time, but it wasn't very long because, again, it doesn't take long for them to walk. Mm-hmm. So they came up and the music ended. And so Colonel Jason Fettig, who's our director, the 28th director, turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, is there another selection that you'd like to hear?" And of course, the French president said, "Well, do you know Bizet, Carmen? Carmen?" And it just so happens that we have a Carmen arrangement in our folders, and our principal flautist, Beth McDonald, who's fantastic soloist. She's fantastic. It was, I can't remember which part of it, but it's the one that has the beautiful flute solo in it, in the Carmen Fantasy score, or the Carmen score. And so we played that piece for the French president and the president and their first ladies standing right in front of us.
Nice.
And
when was this?
This was just, it was whenever the French president came. This last time. You could probably look it up on YouTube or on Google. Mm. But, and there was no press there. It was just them. It was just those four people, maybe an aide or something, and then the orchestra. And they were thrilled. And of course, President Trump said these guys are world class, so they were, I mean, it was a win. It was a win, and it was an icebreaker, and they went up, and I'm sure that helped them.
Yeah.
In terms of diplomacy. And so that's the kind of stuff that we can do, again, to aid in these meetings of state that happen, that music can grease the skids, to use a term, use a plebeian term. It can grease the skids. So yeah, it's the band has been really instrumental in a lot of ways, again, to use the pun, but over the years to help that happen. During World War II, here's another great story. The band played a concert for Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt in the rain on the South Lawn. And it was just them. So just those two in two chairs sitting, listening to a concert by the Marine Band in the rain.
Wow.
And again, you can't help but think that did cement that relationship. I mean, Winston Churchill was basically coming to the United States begging for help, and the people in the United States were like, "Look, we came once a couple years, 20 years ago. We don't want to do this again." And he's like, "Look, this is different. You've got to help." And so Roosevelt, they were kind of working that out, I think, and I think the Marine Band played a part in that. Yeah. What else you guys want to know? Are we good? We done? Is that about all you can take?
Yeah. It's not all we can take, but I think we'll leave it pretty close to there. We can't thank you enough for coming out and turning on your computer during the health crisis and doing this interview with us. Wow, that was a lot of information, but that was incredible. That was very, very cool to get to discuss those things with Dr. Jenkins earlier today. We wanted to thank you guys for listening to this episode number 3 from the Early American Brass Band podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at eabb.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite listening platform for podcasts, and also like us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts and want to help the podcast out, it would be great if you would feel so inclined as to rate the podcast and leave a review. That really helps us get boosted up in search results for people who are looking for new material to listen to. So if you would like to leave us a review and a rating, we'd greatly appreciate it.
This episode's featured album is going to be the CD re-release of the Empire Brass Quintet's famous Civil War music album titled The American Brass Band Journal. This CD was re-released, I think, in 2005 as a combination of two albums. The Empire Brass Quintet brought in, they call it the Empire Brass Quintet and Friends, came together and recorded music in 1976 and recorded a bunch of music from the Brass Band Journal, which was a publication of music that came out in the 1850s, and they released a recording of all these different songs. And then 2 years later, in 1978, under the direction of Dr. Frederick Fennell, they recorded the Empire Brass Quintet and Friends, the American Brass Band Journal Revisited. And that second album is actually, the title is a little bit misleading. The music that they play on the Revisited album is actually from the Stratton's Military Journal, so it's not from the from the Brass Band Journal, but they just released it under a similar title for the Empire's album, just for continuity. So our featured album is the American Brass Band Journal CD from 2005 by the American Brass Quintet. Information for that album will be available on our website under show notes.
Yeah, as always, each episode will have a show notes section on the website, which is eabbpodcast.com. So be sure to head over there if you want to go down a rabbit hole on anything we mentioned during the episode. We'll have links for you over there.
Thank you very much.
Talk to you on the next one.